Elvis Presley's death on August 16, 1977, sent shockwaves around the world. He wasn't just a musician, he was a symbol, an icon, a once-in-a-generation star. But beneath the velvet curtains of Graceland and the gold records on the walls was a man who, despite being adored by millions, lived in quiet pain, surrounded by fame, but yearning for something far more ordinary. And no one saw that side more clearly than Nancy Rooks. Nancy wasn't just an employee. As a maid and cook at Graceland for years, she saw the real Elvis, up close, in the quiet moments when the cameras were gone and the crowds faded. For decades, she stayed silent. She never wrote a tell-all, never sold her story. But now, in the final months of her own life, Nancy is finally opening up. And what she shares is deeply personal, incredibly human, and far more complex than the tragic story we've been told. The morning Elvis died wasn't filled with drama or spectacle. It began, at least for Nancy, with a simple request: "Bring me a glass of water." That was the last thing Elvis Presley ever asked of anyone. It's such a small detail, easy to overlook, but to Nancy it meant everything. Because that one sentence said something powerful. Elvis was still trying. He was still present. He was still living, not fading. Nancy remembers that morning clearly. She had been working as usual, preparing the kitchen, making sure the house was in order. Elvis had been keeping odd hours, as he often did, staying up through the night, reading, talking, thinking. But there was nothing about that morning that screamed the end. No dramatic farewell. No sense of doom. Just a man in his pajamas asking for a drink of water. To her, that moment was proof that he hadn't given up. That he wasn't resigned to his fate, as so many have believed. Inside Graceland, beyond the velvet ropes and gold-plated frames, lived a man whose life was far quieter and far more complicated than his public persona ever let on. Nancy Rooks didn't see Elvis through a fan's eyes. She saw the late-night pacing, she heard the sighs, she felt the weight he carried behind his polite smiles. While the public imagined Elvis Presley as a tireless performer in full command of his world, Nancy witnessed a different man, gentle, uncertain, and often searching for something no amount of fame could provide. He wasn't the extravagant showman at home. In the privacy of his mansion, Elvis moved slowly, sometimes aimlessly, as if trying to find meaning in a life that had become too big for him to manage. Nancy recalls how he would spend hours in the quiet upstairs halls, reading books on spirituality, metaphysics, and life after death. Titles like The Impersonal Life and The Prophet weren't there for show. He studied them, underlined passages, and brought them up in conversation as he tried to connect dots that fame had blurred. He was endlessly curious. Often he'd call Nancy or other staff into the kitchen in the early hours, not to give orders, but to talk, to ask questions about life, about God, about what people thought happened after we die. And these weren't rehearsed thoughts meant for cameras. They were honest, sometimes childlike inquiries from a man who had everything but still felt empty in all the places that mattered. Nancy remembered one evening when Elvis sat at the breakfast bar, barely touching his food. He had just come from the racquetball court, one of his rare moments of physical exertion those days, but instead of resting, he wanted to talk. Not about music or money, but about dreams. Not ambitions, literal dreams. He described a recurring one in which he was a nameless man, walking alone in a desert, unnoticed and free. He'd ask, "What do you think that means, Nancy?" And she never had an answer, but she could see that he hoped she did. Elvis was surrounded by people, yet constantly alone. The entourage, the security, even the staff, many played roles, and he knew it. Nancy, however, was someone he seemed to trust without needing to impress. Maybe because she didn't ask for anything. Maybe because she never treated him like the king. And in that space, she saw the truest version of him, someone aching for simplicity, craving peace, and, most of all, yearning to be understood not as an icon, but as a person. To the outside world, Graceland was a dream palace, a symbol of success, power, and eternal stardom. But to Nancy Rooks, it was something entirely different. She saw how those lavish halls became echo chambers of loneliness. Rooms that should have been filled with celebration often sat silent. Behind the heavy drapes and ornate chandeliers was a man slowly being crushed by the weight of his own name. Elvis didn't just live with fame, he was trapped by it. According to Nancy, even stepping outside for fresh air required coordination, secrecy, and security. Want to go for a drive at midnight just to clear your head? Not without bodyguards. Want to take a walk in the neighborhood like a regular guy? Forget it. The world didn't see Elvis Presley as a man. They saw a myth in motion. And every time he stepped out in public, he had to wear the costume, smile the smile, and play the part. Nancy recalled how he would sometimes peer out the windows of Graceland at the gates where fans camped day and night. He loved them, but at times their constant presence reminded him that he could never truly be free. She said he would sigh and say, "They don't even know me. They love someone who doesn't exist anymore." That line stayed with her, because in that moment, she realized the king wasn't trying to push people away. He was mourning a version of himself that fame had erased. It wasn't about ego. Elvis didn't crave attention for attention's sake. In fact, Nancy said he often avoided mirrors. He didn't want to see the version of himself the world insisted he be. What he wanted was peace. Time to breathe without being asked for autographs, photographs, or interviews. He wanted to strip away the glitter and just be Elvis. The man? Not Elvis. The myth. There were moments, rare and raw, when he talked openly about disappearing. Not in a dramatic way, but in a sincere, almost childlike dream of escaping the machinery that had built him. He'd talk about buying a ranch in Montana, or a cabin in Colorado, somewhere quiet where he could ride horses, write music, and live by no one's clock but his own. These weren't just daydreams. They were detailed, specific visions. He even looked at property brochures. But every plan, every whisper of escape, eventually ran into the same wall. He couldn't leave Elvis Presley behind. And maybe that's what haunted him the most, knowing that the world would never let him be just a man again. Even in his most private moments, the crown never came off. One of the most heartbreaking elements of Nancy's account is how much it contradicts the accepted story of Elvis's final days. Most people think he was spiraling out of control. Reckless, unhealthy, resigned to death. But Nancy says that's not the truth. He was trying. He was talking about changing his diet, about cutting back on the medications, about touring again, this time on his terms. He wanted to reconnect with his daughter, Lisa Marie. He was planning a trip, making small changes in his routine, and trying to reconnect with his music. She doesn't pretend he wasn't struggling. He absolutely was. But he wasn't defeated, and that's what hurts the most. That maybe, just maybe, he could have made it. If he'd had more time, if he'd had more help, if the world had seen past the legend and offered him the space to simply be. Nancy Rooks' final words about Elvis aren't bitter. They're filled with warmth and compassion. She saw him as a man, flawed, yes, but also kind, thoughtful, and filled with longing. She reminds us that behind every icon is a person who just wants to be understood. She hopes people will remember Elvis not just for how he died, but how he lived. The laughter in the kitchen, the deep late-night talks, the quiet moments, the hope that never truly left him. Because in the end, the king of rock and roll wasn't trying to disappear. He was trying to find himself. If Nancy's story gave you a new perspective on Elvis Presley, if it reminded you that even legends need love, understanding, and peace, then hit that like button, subscribe, and tap the bell for more powerful, untold stories like this. Dive into our other videos for deeper looks into the people behind the headlines. And don't forget to follow us on social media. Links are in the description.